Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, February 7th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. will not lift sanctions on Syria after a devastating earthquake. So Syria and Turkey were hit with a really bad earthquake. In Syria, mostly hit the northwest portion of the country. Thousands of people are dead. As of Monday night, the death toll is over 3,700, and it's rising. It seems like that number keeps changing. And right now in Turkey, again, this is as of Monday night, 2,316 people are reported killed in Turkey, and 1,444 have been reported killed in Syria. So, despite this horrible earthquake, the U.S. State Department on Monday showed no interest in lifting crippling economic sanctions on Syria that are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. And that's not my words. That's how Antony Blinken put it back in October 2021. He said the U.S. policy is to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. So, with sanctions like that in place, of course, it's going to impede relief efforts. So, the Syrian health ministry said that 711 people died in government controlled territory, because, again, this is northwest Syria. And then you have portions of the Idlib province in the northwest. I should have put a map in here, but portions of Idlib that are mostly controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is an al-Qaeda linked group. And reports from that area say that 733 people have died there as well. So again, a lot of dead Syrians. State Department spokesman Ned Price said Monday that the U.S. would work with NGOs in Syria, but would not engage with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He gave no indication that the U.S. would lift sanctions on Syria. And when asked by antiwar.com if the Biden administration was considering lifting sanctions, the State Department referred to Price's comments about working with NGOs. I asked them if they're talking about lifting sanctions, considering it, and they pointed to his comments, which didn't really address it. So I take it as nope, they don't have any plans on lifting sanctions. Price said, quote, "In Turkey, we have a partner in the government. In Syria, we have a partner in the form of NGOs on the ground who are providing humanitarian support," end quote. He was actually pressed by a journalist on why the U.S. would not engage with Damascus. And Price said, quote, "It would be quite ironic, if not counterproductive, for the U.S. to reach out to a government that has brutalized its people over the course of a dozen years now," end quote. So, it's very rich coming from the U.S. government because they don't care about Syrian people no matter what they say. Price claimed that no other country has done more than the U.S. to provide aid to the Syrian people, but U.S. sanctions on Syria have a devastating impact on the civilian population. This was recently detailed in a report by a UN special rapporteur that just visited the country. Again, they're specifically designed to prevent reconstruction. They target the energy and construction sectors. So it's just a really bad situation in Syria for the civilians. Not to mention the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria, where they control most of the country's oil resources. So, according to Al Jazeera, this group, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, which is a U.S.-based advocacy group, they called on Monday for the immediate lifting of U.S. sanctions on Syria. They said, quote, "A lifting of the sanctions will open the doors for additional and supplemental aid that will provide immediate relief to those in need," end quote. So there might be some pressure on the Biden administration to at least give a straight answer if they're going to lift sanctions or not. So U.S. sanctions, there's a history of them impeding relief efforts after earthquakes. In June 2022, there was a huge earthquake in Afghanistan that killed over 1,100 people. And UN officials said that sanctions were complicating aid deliveries. But U.S. sanctions on Afghanistan remained, and they are still effective today, despite UN warnings that 6 million Afghans are facing the risk of famine. So, as I always cover, U.S. sanctions on these countries, just have such a horrible impact on the ordinary people that live there, and they never fulfill the stated goal, which is changing the government. The government always stays the same. So hopefully, I don't know. There's enough pressure that maybe they'll ease some sanctions, but I don't have much faith. And then we just have a story here. This is actually from CNN of all places, but they just have an updated wow. I mean, they have an updated tally on the deaths, and now it's up to more than 4,300 people are dead in Turkey and Syria after this earthquake. So, a really just a horrible situation there. All right, so the next one here, UN chief warns that the war in Ukraine could turn into a wider war. So this is Antonio Guterres. He is the UN Secretary General. He made this warning on Monday that the world is heading toward a wider war as the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate. He told the UN General Assembly, quote, "The Russian invasion of Ukraine is inflicting untold suffering on the Ukrainian people with profound global implications. The prospects for peace keep diminishing. I fear the world is not sleepwalking into a wider war. I fear it is doing so with its eyes wide open," end quote. So his comments came, as they come as the U.S. and its allies continue to escalate military aid for Ukraine, bringing NATO and Russia closer to a direct confrontation, which of course could quickly spiral into a nuclear war. And I basically just list other warnings here that we've seen from other, world leaders, including the Western officials that are leading the policy of dumping weapons into Ukraine. Uh, Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, he warned in December that he feared the war in Ukraine could get out of control and spread into a major war between NATO and Russia. And he said, things could go horribly wrong. President Biden back in October said that the world was closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite this realization, for both Biden and Stoltenberg, they continue to test Russia's red lines. There's no end in sight to these escalations. And then the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they believe that the risk of nuclear war is actually higher now than at any time than during the Cold War. The group placed their doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight recently, and that's the closest it has ever been. And even the RAND Corporation, which is a Pentagon-funded think tank that has been shaping U.S. policies for decades, recognized in a recently issued report titled "Avoiding a Long War" that a protracted conflict brings a greater risk of nuclear war. So all these warnings, yet it is still full steam ahead. All right, and I left the one up from yesterday about how the U.S. blocked this peace deal that Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, was trying to negotiate early in the war. Because that's just a huge story, very important, and it was misreported by the mainstream, corporate media, whatever you want to call it. They focused on the fact that Putin guaranteed he wouldn't kill Zelensky, and they didn't mention, just didn't think worth mentioning that he said the U.S. and France and Germany and the U.K. blocked a potential peace deal. All right, so the next one here, Republicans pressure Biden to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine. So key Republican members of Congress are launching a two-front campaign to pressure the Biden administration to send Ukraine more advanced weapons. And this was according to a report from Defense One that came out over the weekend. But we have seen that, just Republican leadership in general pressuring Biden and publicly to call for more weapons. But they're saying this is a two-pronged campaign. And one aspect is to pressure Biden officials through closed door briefings, and the other is to apply public pressure, something that Republican leadership has been doing throughout the war. And the main demand from these hawkish Republicans is for the U.S. to provide these MQ-1C Gray Eagle drones, F-16 fighter jets, and the Army tactical missile systems, also known as the ATACMS, which have a range of up to 190 miles. And again, I mean, it's redundant for me to say again that, this is going to just risking war with Russia, all this stuff. And the latest weapons package that the Biden administration announced includes the ground-launched small diameter bombs for the first time. And these bombs, they're precision-guided bombs missiles that can hit targets up to 94 miles away, which is nearly twice the range of the munitions that Ukraine has been using with the U.S. provided HIMARS rocket systems. Um, but nearly doubling Ukraine's strike range did not satisfy the hawkish Republicans. Senator Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi, was quoted by Defense One, and he said, quote, "I have repeatedly called for more, better, and faster aid to Ukraine, but today's announcement from the president is more of the same unnecessary slow walking that has gotten us to this point. We should begin trading on the F-16s and the ATACMS they have asked for immediately and seek to transfer these weapon systems as soon as possible. Training for Abrams and the ground-launched small-diameter bomb should have started months ago," end quote. Rep. Michael McCall, he's a Republican from Texas. He chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's previously called for Biden to send the ATACMS so that they could be used to strike Crimea. And for their part, Ukrainian officials appear to be focusing their efforts on securing F-16s or other advanced Western fighter jets. That's their main demand right now. It seems like, in their letter to Santa, as Reznikov put it. While Republican leadership is pushing for more military aid to Ukraine, there are signs that they are thinking about how the war will end. As I went over the other day, Rep. Mike Rogers, Republican from Alabama, he's the head of the House Armed Services Committee. He also favors sending these longer range weapons, but he's insisting that we have to send them everything now so the conflict ends by the summer. And he's saying the thing needs to be wrapped up by the summer, but again, so much could happen between now and then. And sending more and more aid like this, especially if they start getting into fighter jets, that might just provoke Russia more to continue its assault and not be interested in any kind of peace talks. All right. So the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Germany approves the transfer of its Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine. So after caving pressure from inside NATO and agreeing to export over a dozen Leopard 2 tanks to Kiev, Berlin has now added its older Leopard 1s to the package of Western-made main battle tanks. Ukraine expects to receive over 100 NATO-made tanks in the first wave of deliveries. So a German government official confirmed that Berlin authorized the transfer of these Leopard 1 tanks. So it's their older one, and Der Spiegel reported that they're going to send 29 of the Leopard 1 tanks. And Germany is also sending 14 of the Leopard 2 tanks. So that's about 33 tanks that they're sending over there. Did I do that math right? No, 43. Sorry. So they're getting more tanks. And Kyle points out that for nearly a year, Germany rebuked Kiev's demands for main battle tanks, but the pressure really mounted. And, they did it because the Biden administration said they would send the Abrams tanks, which Germany didn't expect. It seems like they were kind of keeping that as a demand, that they wouldn't send the tanks unless the UN sent the Abrams. I think, I don't know if they expected Biden to actually go through with that, but they're sending all these tanks now. All right, the next one here, the U.S. considers deploying long-range missiles to Japan. The U.S. is considering deploying new missiles to Japan as part of its buildup aimed at China, and this is according to a report from a Japanese newspaper, Sankei. The report cited sources involved in U.S.-Japan relations and said that the U.S. might deploy medium-range missiles, but is also considering sending Tomahawk missiles or long-range hypersonic weapons, which are still under development. The U.S. doesn't deploy these hypersonic weapons, and the fact, this is just a report in Japanese media, but the fact that they're even talking about deploying long-range hypersonic missiles to this region, I think is very provocative toward China, because the whole thing with hypersonic missiles is that they're so fast. They can't be intercepted, and it gives a lot less time to think. If China knows the U.S. launched a hypersonic missile, they have a very short amount of time to decide how to retaliate. If they think it's a nuclear weapon, who knows what could happen. So the location for the missile deployments has not been chosen, but they are considering Kyushu, which is Japan's southernmost main island. And this deployment would align with a Pentagon plan. They've been wanting to place long range missiles along the first island chain, which stretches from southern Japan through Taiwan down to the Philippines and down to Malaysia. So if you're watching the video here, you see on this map, this is the first island chain, bends around toward Vietnam, and it starts, at that southernmost Japanese, again, main island. This doesn't include Okinawa and those islands and what they control in the East China Sea. But that's really where the first island chain starts. And this is something the Pentagon wants to do as part of its buildup against China. I think they're going to have trouble trying to get missiles, in Malaysia and places like that. Of course, I don't think Vietnam is going to be interested, but Japan, they could always just send more stuff there. So Tomahawk missiles, they have a huge range of over 1,000 miles, and Japan is planning to purchase their own Tomahawk missiles as part of their big military buildup. Their unprecedented military buildup, which involves doubling their military spending over the next 5 years. That's going to bring Japan's military budget it's going to make it the third highest in the world. And again, this is all aimed at China. When they announced this, they also released a national security strategy document that named China their top priority or top threat, similar to U.S. government, strategies. And the U.S. is encouraging this Japanese buildup, which breaks from Tokyo's U.S. imposed constitution that was imposed after World War II that limits the Japanese military to strictly defensive purposes. That's being done away with here, mainly by them looking to acquire these Tomahawk missiles because over 1,000-mile range. I mean, that puts a lot of things in target inside China and North Korea. And U.S. officials recently announced new steps to boost military ties, including the deployment of a U.S. Marine Corps unit in Okinawa's islands that will be armed with anti-ship missiles. So more missiles aimed at China. So again, these long-range missiles, hypersonics are still being developed and tested and everything. And this report isn't confirmed, but I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. is considering this just based on what their plans are, what they want to do in the region. All right, so the next one here, more balloon. I don't know what to make of all this balloon stuff, but I just thought this was worth telling you about, writing up. The NORAD commander says that Chinese balloons that entered the U.S. during the Trump administration went undetected. So the head of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, that is NORAD, claimed on Monday that Chinese balloons that entered U.S. airspace during the Trump administration were not detected by the command. And this command is responsible for the protection of the airspace of Canada and the continental United States. This is Air Force General Glenn Van Herk, and he heads NORAD as well as U.S. Northern Command. Northern Command, they're responsible for U.S. military operations in North America. So he said, quote, "As NORAD commander, it's my responsibility to detect threats to North America. I will tell you that we did not detect those threats, and that's a domain awareness gap that we have to figure out," end quote. I think all the money they spend on, missile defense and stuff, and he's saying that they didn't detect these balloons. I don't know, again, what to make of all this. If these balloons, again, the U.S. says they're surveillance balloons. China insists they're weather balloons, civilian. They were blown off course. It's tough to really know what's going on here. And it's tough to think that even if they did detect these balloons did travel over the U.S. back then, if anybody would have really thought it was a big deal, because, again, they had open skies treaty with Russia that allowed unarmed surveillance flights over the U.S. China wasn't involved in that treaty, but still, I mean, just foreign surveillance aircraft being over the U.S. might not have really raised any red flags. But again, who knows? So during a briefing over the weekend, so this came after Trump and his former high-level officials, including, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and people like that, strongly denied Pentagon claims that similar balloons entered U.S. airspace 3 times during the Trump administration. They really denied it. And then the Northcom commander came out and said, yeah, it happened, but it was undetected, and they only discovered it after Trump left office, which, again, very strange. Not really sure who to believe here or what to make of this. I just thought it was worth pointing out. And since the U.S. shot down the balloon off the coast of South Carolina, They say they're working to recover the debris. So we'll see what they say about that. And Chinese officials have said that they kept close communication with the U.S. During this entire incident. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken still canceled his trip to China because of the balloon. And I just mentioned too that this is not the first time that a surveillance aircraft or an alleged surveillance aircraft sparked a diplomatic crisis between the US and China. On April 1st, 2001, a US spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet off the coast of Hainan Island in the South China Sea, which is a Chinese island, and it's not disputed or anything. It's a big Chinese province. And the American pilot had to land in Chinese territory. The Chinese pilot went missing and is presumed dead. And with the U.S. increasing its military activity in the South China Sea in recent years, including flying a lot more spy planes, increases the risk of an accident like that. And if something like that happened right now with the state of U.S.-China relations, who knows what could happen? It could really spiral into something. All right. So the next one's here. The U.S. ramps up operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So, U.S. Central Command announced last week that it was involved in 43 operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria in the month of January. Task and Purpose reported that the monthly average for U.S. operations against ISIS in 2022 was 26 per month. So, they're saying that this 43 in January signals that the U.S. could be stepping up its assaults against ISIS. So while ISIS no longer controls any territory, there are remnants of the group in the remote regions of Syria and Iraq. CENTCOM said that each raid in January was conducted with partner forces. And in Iraq, that's the government. And in Syria, that is the Kurdish-led SDF. The head of CENTCOM said that they heavily rely on these partner forces, and the command claimed that in both operations, 11 suspected ISIS operatives were killed and 227 were detained. CENTCOM did not offer any information about possible civilian casualties. As I have to always say, the Pentagon, we know that they'll undercount civilian casualties. They'll lie about civilian casualties when there's no accountability. And with these operations, it's tough to really know what's going on. In its report, CENTCOM put out a report for 2022. They said that in that year, they were involved in operations that killed 682 suspected ISIS fighters. That's a lot of people that they said they killed. And of course, the report did not mention any potential harm to civilians, despite reports that operations the U.S. was involved in did harm civilians, did kill civilians, including this big battle at a prison in northeast Syria that housed ISIS fighters, and it also housed children. And U.S. Helicopters, were bombing the prison in support of the SDF, and there were reports that children were killed, and they didn't address that. In a raid, too, there was reports that civilians and children were killed, also not addressed by CENTCOM. And while on paper, the U.S. presence in Syria is about fighting ISIS, it's a big part of it is about the economic campaign against Damascus, against Syria, as I was just discussing. By backing the SDF, they control about 1/3 of Syria. There's 1,000 U.S. troops there. So, it's an occupation. And again, it's just part of the economic campaign. Because if the U.S. left, the Kurds said that they've said time and time again that they could have a rapprochement with Syria, with the Syrian government, and both of them are very effective fighting forces against ISIS. They don't need the U.S. there to take care of these ISIS remnants. All right, so the last one here, this is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles, and it's a poll that says Americans are far less hawkish on North Korea and China than policy elites are. A large majority of Americans support talks aimed at reducing tensions with North Korea and China, according to a survey released Friday by the Harris poll. The results are at odds with the state of opinion in Washington, where policy elites continue to one-up each other over how to respond to an incident in which an apparent Chinese surveillance balloon flew over the U.S. in recent days. Again, the fact that Blinken cancels his trip, it's just so pathetic. 2/3 of respondents agreed that the U.S. should engage in dialogue as much as possible to reduce tensions with China, while 20% said Washington should not restart official dialogue and instead should spend more money on a military buildup. So that's good to see that this poll people said that. It's rare, I think, that people are given these questions, because a lot of times you see polls that say, "Oh, everybody's scared of China. They think China's the enemy." But it's kind of how they phrase the questions when people are actually asked, "Oh, do you like the idea of diplomacy?" Most people do. Most people have the instinct to think that diplomacy is good, to think that, not ramping up tensions is good. But unfortunately, the Biden administration doesn't see that way, and hasn't done anything, in this situation with North Korea. Um, and they're just ramping up tensions by increasing war games with South Korea. So it's no good. Um, but anyway, that's it for the news for today. Go check out the viewpoints. We have one from Caitlin Johnstone. The U.S. surrounds China with war machinery while freaking out about balloons. One from James Bond, an economist's solution to the war in Ukraine. One from Lyle Goldstein, is the Ukraine war moving toward a Korea solution? That's over at Responsible Statecraft. One from David Swanson, the Monroe Doctrine is soaked in blood. And then our spotlight is a pretty important story from Aaron Mate over at the Gray Zone about the Duma cover up. The OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, they're an international organization. They recently blamed the Syrian government for an alleged chemical attack in Duma, Syria, April 7th, 2018. A report that they issued from a few years ago concluded, there was a chlorine gas attack, but then whistleblowers from the organization, two people, and I believe a few more might have spoken out and spoken to Aaron in his work at the Gray Zone, said that the results of the report were altered. They concluded that it was unlikely that, there was a chlorine attack. But they were ignored by the media, ignored by the OPCW. And Aaron gets into here, mainly what he focuses on is that this new report goes against OPCW guidelines, kind of the chain of custody. The samples that they used were collected by a third party and not their own inspectors. Their own inspectors that went to Duma and were there on the ground and collected their own samples found a completely different story than what the OPCW turned around and told. And this alleged chemical attack, which they say killed 43 civilians, and there was video footage of a lot of dead people. After this, in April 2018, the Trump administration, I believe along with the UK and France, launched airstrikes on Syria in response. So it's a big scandal because it does look like it was staged in some way. It's not exactly clear what happened, but there's a lot of evidence that says it's not the story that the U.S. wants us to believe. And one of the whistleblowers said that U.S. officials, when they came back and said it was unlikely, that their work showed that it was a chlorine gas attack from above. U.S. officials apparently briefed them and said, "Nah, you're going to find that it was chlorine." The U.S. pressured them. So it seems like this organization is compromised, and they were compromised during the lead up to the Iraq war. Not so much compromised, but I believe John Bolton threatened the head of the OPCW. But anyway, go check that out. It's very detailed. There's a lot to it. I didn't really explain all of it, but it's an important story. But that's it. That's everything for today. I was on Russell Brand's show, which was pretty awesome, and he interviewed me, and I posted a clip from the interview from his show on Rumble. That's where it's streamed, and I put it on my YouTube channel if you want to go check that out. That was pretty great. But that's it. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. If you listen to the audio version, which most of you do, leave a review and a rating and share it around with your friends. That stuff really helps. But that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with a lot more news. Thanks for listening.